So, quick backstory. My boyfriend sent me an article about how trigger warnings may actually be harmful, referencing some recent studies on the effects of trigger warnings. The article said that, according to the research, there was no actual benefit to trigger warnings, and maybe even a slight negative effect. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, you know what, I've never actually seen someone say that a trigger warning was helpful for them. This could be big, if true. I have to check this out for myself. And then I read the papers, and let's just say for now I was underwhelmed. Like, I don't want to give away the plot of the video, but I don't like them. And the way they're being used in the media and by politicians and even by researchers is bad. So let's see if I can break down the problem with trigger warning research. Quick primer on how this video will work. I'll have a number appear up above when I'm making a statement backed by an article or a statement in reference to a particular article or paper. There'll be a source list in the description so you can check everything out for yourself or even, God forbid, do your own research. Cool? Cool. Before we get into the papers in question, let's do a little thought experiment. Let's say we're scientists. And let's say that we want to create an experiment on trigger warnings. Do they actually work? That'll be our main research question. Okay, so that's a little vague, right? What qualifies as work in this context? What does it even mean for a trigger warning to work? To understand that, we should probably understand what trigger warnings even are. Trigger warnings were conceptualized in online spaces to provide warning for discussion of potentially triggering content. For the purposes of this video, when we're talking about triggering or triggers, we're specifically talking about it in the clinical sense of activating or triggering someone's post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Okay, so what is PTSD and what are the symptoms? Well, to step down another little side detour, we're just going to look at a summary of the first two parts of the official American Psychology Association definition. But keep in mind that there are many more parts that go into an actual diagnosis. Part A, exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. This could be directly experiencing it, watching it happen, or even extreme exposure to details of the event. It's important to note that experiencing a traumatic event does not mean you will have PTSD. It's actually somewhat rare. Most people who go through a traumatic event do not develop PTSD. Part B, presence of at least one of the following intrusion symptoms associated with the traumatic event. 1. Recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event. 2. Recurrent distressing dreams related to the traumatic event. 3. Dissociative, reactions, e.g. flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event were recurring. 4. Intense or prolonged psychological distress to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. These definitions were not meant to be read out loud. So, a trigger is something that activates the symptoms of PTSD. A trigger warning, then, is to let people who have PTSD know that something could be triggering for them. Please note that not everyone with PTSD has known triggers. The severity of PTSD differs between people, and triggers can range from very broad to hyper-specific. Now, the purpose of trigger warnings may have ballooned out from this original purpose, but that is a discussion better left for a different video. Let's focus our research experiment on triggers for PTSD, as this is the generally agreed upon definition that is cited in most research papers on trigger warnings. Okay, back to our primary question. What does it mean for a trigger warning to work? Well, I can see two different possibilities here. One is the person avoids the material altogether, just saw the trigger warning and left. 2, the person is able to prepare themselves beforehand and thus reduce or eliminate their negative reaction to it. The basis for this is the idea that sudden, unprompted, unprepared exposure to a trigger is far worse than being prepared for, an idea that seems to be backed up by the literature. Okay, 2 ideas. I'm going to leave them here for a while. Moving on to the scope. Let's think of restrictions for our study. First, since trigger warnings are for people with PTSD, we should probably limit it to people who have PTSD. You might think this is obvious, right? But stay tuned. Second, we'll probably want to make sure the trigger warning is specifically identifying what the potentially triggering material is, rather than a general, this may be triggering warning. This will allow the participants to make informed decisions and to have accurate expectations. Hopefully, that'll remove bias and make our results more accurate to how trigger warnings are encountered in real life. Third, we should probably be trying to trigger their PTSD. As in, we should show them material that we're reasonably sure will trigger their PTSD. Otherwise, if it's not triggering for that person, then we might as well be looking at someone who doesn't have PTSD. A quick sidebar that's not actually about the papers we'll be talking about. This is where some ethical considerations might come up, because we would be actively trying to trigger someone's PTSD, actively causing harm. We're not going to get into the weeds about the ethics of experiment design, but it's just something to note here. If we were designing an experiment trying to trigger someone's PTSD, we would need to make sure we are going about it in an ethical way. Again, this is not related to the papers. I just wanted to bring it up as an aside. Okay, ethics sidebar over. Let's synthesize all this information and rephrase our research question to be more accurate. Do content-specific trigger warnings displayed before triggering material, 1, cause people diagnosed with PTSD to avoid the material, or 2, reduce the negative effects of being triggered? This is the part in the experiment design process where we get into what are you going to measure and how are you going to measure it. This is the tricky part, and it's why some things can be very hard to study, especially in the field of psychology. So, how are you supposed to measure if a trigger warning is working? Good question. Let's go look at the studies. Our main focus is going to be on helping or harming the effect of trigger warnings on individuals with trauma histories, which I'm going to call the primary paper or study, but there is a whole cluster of related papers we'll be touching on. This is one thing that can make talking about research hard. They're always built on assumptions created by other papers, so you've got to track those down and see what their assumptions are, what their results are, and whether their methodology was solid so you can validate the original assumptions. Anyway, I have a lot of thoughts about the primary paper, and we are going to run through the entire thing, so let's just start at the very beginning. The paper begins with an introduction to the topic, starting with what are trigger warnings, going to what is the controversy over trigger warnings, and I've just got to say, them including a reference to an opinion piece in The Atlantic called The Coddling of the American Mind is hilarious to me. At least other papers have the decency to cite from something neutral like The Chronicle of Higher Education. The introduction continues by listing other papers that have studied trigger warnings. There are 6 studies related to the effects of trigger warnings and 2 studies related to the concept of avoidance, for a total of 7 studies. 1 study covers both. Fun thing to note is that 2 of those studies were conducted by the same authors of the primary study, and one of those 2 studies was a pre-registered replication of the other. Pre-registering is essentially a way to guarantee accountability. Before you've even started the study, you are publishing things like your hypothesis, your research plan, or even your analytical techniques. It guarantees that you aren't just changing things mid-study to get the results you want, which, unfortunately, is a problem. Replications are redoing an experiment. Basically, you follow exactly what the original study did and see if you get the same results. It's a way to ensure that there wasn't some sort of bias or bad luck or sometimes even lying that skewed the results of the original study. You might have heard of the replication crisis, which is where we're finding a disconcerting amount of studies, particularly in psychology, but it's affecting a lot of disciplines, are not replicable, meaning we cannot guarantee that their results are actually real. It's also brought attention to how studies can manipulate their data or their results to fit their hypothesis. It's an ongoing crisis that brings critical focus to the idea of peer-reviewed research, how we fund research, how we analyze and report results, and the very future of science itself. Speaking of replication crisis, how do you like that transition? The replication study did not duplicate basically any of the significant results from the first study. We'll talk about what that means a bit later. It might be a good thing to mention that the primary study is also partially attempting a replication of the other two studies, this time focusing on traumatized individuals. Oh, did I forget to mention? None of the 7 studies on the effects of trigger warnings looked into people who experienced trauma, let alone people with PTSD. I went to the papers myself to check, but I didn't even have to. The primary paper puts it like this. None of the studies has exclusively focused on the primary intended target of trigger warnings, survivors of trauma. So, the foundation for the primary study is 7 other studies that have, in my professional opinion, completely useless results because they didn't study people with PTSD. Cool. Great start. Now, I want to note, the authors of the primary study are actually attempting to address this very criticism. You can view the primary study as a direct response to criticism that their other research has not looked at traumatized individuals. Okay, let's move on to the methods. There's a lot to cover here since we are doing an in-depth reading of the primary paper, and I'm forcing you to engage with it. Let's dig in. The primary study does screen for people who have experienced trauma. However, the preliminary screening only looks for people who have undergone a traumatic event, not for PTSD. Later, they do look for PTSD symptoms, but I wanted to point out that they essentially have 2 groups in the study. One that experienced trauma, and one that either has or could have PTSD. I'll explain what that means in a bit. The structure of this study is done entirely online using the crowdsourcing platform Amazon Mechanical Turk, with participants reading short passages from literature. The passages were chosen to give a range of different levels of potential distress. I want to make a note here that triggers aren't always being directly reminded of the trauma per se. Like, some people do not get triggered when reading depictions that are similar to their trauma, but they do get triggered by certain scents or sounds. It's remarkably dependent on the person. Also, I don't have any scientific basis for the next statement, but the literature passages in the markedly distressing section often feel kind of weak. I don't know. It feels like there's something different between, say, where trigger warnings were first used online, people describing their sexual assault, and the honestly pretty non-descriptive scene in Crime and Punishment where the guy acts as an old lady. I don't have any real basis for saying this, other than it just feels different. Though, there is a very graphic description of a deadly car accident in the passages, so not all of them are like that. The study measures a lot of things, so let's just break them down. After each passage, the participants filled out a self-reported emotion scale. So, on a scale from 0 to 100, how strongly are you feeling the following emotions? Sad, happy, afraid, anxious, angry, content, and disgusted. Now, they only used the scores for anxious in their analysis, but they asked all of these to try to limit bias. Also, there's not anything wrong with using a 101-point scale. It's a totally legitimate scale. I just personally find it deeply funny. Like, tell me, are you feeling a 68 sad or a 69 sad? Moving on. They then measure responses on the centrality of events scale. We're going to be talking about it in depth later on, but a quick primer while we're here. The centrality of events scale is a scale from 1 to 5 that measures how much an individual feels that their trauma is central to their identity. Now, this is kind of a tricky thing because having PTSD will disrupt your life. That's why it's a disorder that needs treatment. Of course, it's going to be on some level central to your life. But the scale seems to focus more on your perception of trauma being central to your identity, not just the level of effect it has on someone's life. I don't super want to talk about Cronbach's alpha here, so if you're reading the study along with me and you're wondering what the alpha symbol is all about, just check the sources. I'll put a quick footnote there. Next is the Perceived Post-Traumatic Vulnerability Scale Self. God, these psychologists just have to have the longest names, don't they? This scale is just asking if the participant were to be traumatized, how likely do they think they would have emotional impairment? This is a 100-point scale, so from 1 to 100. Next is the Perceived Post-Traumatic Vulnerability Scale Other, which is the same as before, but about the average person. Also a 100-point scale. Next, on the Life Events Checklist for DSM-5, the participants chose from a list of traumatic events that can cause PTSD, which ones they've been through. Then is the PTSD checklist for DSM-5, also called the PCL-5, which is screening for PTSD symptoms. It is not, mind you, a clinical diagnosis tool, but studies have found that this checklist does predict, pretty accurately, a PTSD diagnosis for certain scores. This study uses a 33 as a cutoff for their purposes, which is supported by a study, but there is some debate over what scores work for what purposes and a general need for more research on this scale. Regardless, we finally have a measure for whether the participants have PTSD. Remember this one, it's important. Next, the Words Can Harm scale, a scale developed by the authors of the study to measure a participant's belief that words can cause serious and lasting emotional harm. This scale is to test the author's hypothesis that if you believe that words can harm, you are more likely to be harmed by words. Also a 100-point scale, the authors really love their 100-point scales, except for that one 101-point scale at the start. Consistency is the bane of mankind. The next measure is the Trigger Warnings Attitude Assessment, which is 3 questions on a 7-point scale asking about the participants' attitudes towards trigger warnings. The only question that was used in the analysis for this study was the 3rd one. I have personally seen many trigger warnings used before. An important part of this study was the question that asked individuals to mark if any parts of the passages reminded them of their trauma. They called this trauma matching passages. Remember, that's similar to one of the limitations we talked about earlier, but it still kind of misses the mark, right? Even if it's similar to the traumatic event, it still might not trigger PTSD symptoms. Also, they don't limit the analysis of this criteria to just people with PTSD. There are some demographics questions, some attention checks. The authors kept track of when people dropped out of the study. Importantly, they do ask if the participant has a PTSD diagnosis. Another important limitation from our list earlier. Not that it helps them. More on that later. You may have noticed my disdain for this study, and this next section is where I'm going to talk about why. You might think, since this study does meet some of our limitations in some parts, that it should at least have some useful results. Unfortunately, it does not. Before we dig into the research, let me just address one thing. You might be wondering why I'm going so in-depth with this one specific study. The first reason is that I've spent something like 14 hours trying to understand the results of this study, including learning about statistical techniques I didn't know beforehand, and it sucked. So you are going to experience this with me. Second, I've mostly seen this study being referenced in the media and not the others as much. The third reason, if I may get a little idealistic here, is that I want to encourage a greater understanding of how studies work and how to critically examine them. I think it's important to have some level of literacy with research papers, so when you hear wild claims from the media or encounter new evidence, you can look to the source material and understand it yourself. I don't know if this video will actually do that, but hey, I want to try. The results. I'm just upfront going to say that I will not seriously consider any of the results unless they're specified to be only either the diagnosed PTSD people or the people who scored high enough on the symptom test as specified in the methods. I may still touch on the other results to make a broader point, but I don't think they have any real merit. This eliminates most of the results in the study, but I hope I have sufficiently explained why and that you forgive me this. The specific analytical technique used in the paper is Bayes factor analysis, also known as the bane of my existence. I don't want to go too technical with an explanation or dive into the theory behind it, because it's very long and very complicated, so here's a light explanation of Bayes factor as I understand it. Please note that I learned this from my own research, so I may be wrong, If I am wrong, I do sincerely apologize, and I will fix the mistake in the footnotes. So maybe check out the footnotes. Bayes factor analysis is used to find relative evidence between two hypotheses. It's basically a way to test whether the data found supports one model over the other. So, say you're measuring whether a new drug is effective, and you measure a response between people who took the drug and people who took a placebo. One hypothesis could be that the drug doesn't work, so there's no difference between the two groups. Another hypothesis is that the drug works, so there is a difference. Well, you plug all that into the Bayes factor analysis, and bing, bang, boom, you get an answer. Well, you don't get a yes or no answer, you'll get a likelihood answer, as in ambiguous, substantial, strong, decisive. It's one of the fun things about science, is that you're not really getting definitive answers, just it's likely this is the case, or more frequently with p-values, it's extremely unlikely this didn't happen. Okay, so this is where things get tricky. For the primary study, besides the replication analysis, the two competing models are no observed effect and that there is an observed effect. For the replication analysis, the two competing models are no observed effect and that the observed effect is equal to the effect from previous studies. One thing to note is that I think this paper didn't publish some critical numbers specific to Bayes factor analysis. From my understanding, you need an assumed prior for Bayes factor analysis to work, which is basically your guess for the strength of the observed effect. In our previous example, while the hypothesis is that there is an effect, you still need to assume the level of that effect to calculate the Bayes factor. For the replication analysis, the authors used a procedure from another paper to calculate their assumed prior from the previous studies. For the exploratory tests, I believe the calculation of the assumed prior is buried in their code, but honestly, I can't be bothered to read code. Regardless, for my reading of the papers on the best practice for Bayes factor analysis, you should publish your numbers and your justification for your assumed prior. The primary paper states where they got their assumed priors from, but they don't actually state the numbers, leaving it up to the reader to calculate it themselves. Another thing about Bayes factor analysis is that it says nothing about the level of effect, just whether an effect exists. This is important to note because the wording of the statistical analysis can be a little confusing. When the study says substantial evidence, they do not mean a strong effect. They simply mean it's very likely, but not guaranteed, that the effect exists. However, it does appear that this study also publishes a measurement of the effect. So, there are many ways to analyze the effect size, each with their own reasoning and peculiarities and strengths and weaknesses and what have you. The primary paper seems to go with Cohen's D, which you'll see reported alongside the BF, Bayes factor, and the CI, confidence interval. Cohen's D varies in size, and I'm not going to get super into the weeds on it, but generally, you got 3 points of scale: small, medium, and large. The exact number can change depending on what you're studying, though. The primary paper does not provide any clarity on why they're calculating D, what their scale for D could be, nor any analysis of the D values they report. Okay, quick sidebar. Not commenting on the level of effect is not inherently a bad thing. At least, I think it's not inherently bad. I'll admit, I'm not incredibly well versed in the standards with regards to effect sizes, but it seems to me, at least, that plenty of studies aren't concerned with effect size. Now, why that is, or whether that's a good thing, is a whole other can of worms I will not be touching. I just wanted to clarify that I don't believe there's anything necessarily wrong with not studying effect size, though it could be argued to be important in certain cases. Final thing about Bayes factor, it's important to note that the numbers from Bayes factor analysis shouldn't be treated as a clean cutoff point. It's still possible that some of the time, the other theory is actually correct. You can kind of think of this like odds. A BF of 3 can be thought of meaning the odds are 3 to 1. Pretty good, but still a gamble. And that's just science. It's just science and stats, baby. The universe is an unknowable void, and all our attempts at understanding it are guesses at best. The results of the study, broadly, we'll get to the interesting bits in a second, but broadly, the results of the study are that they found no effects on the level of anxiety after the passage was read. There are no changes in anxiety for the full sample, no changes in those who reported PTSD diagnosis, no changes in trauma matching passages. Alright, let's get into the actually interesting results, few as they may be. Among those who met the cutoff number for PTSD symptoms on the PCL-5, the study actually found that trigger warnings increased anxiety, meaning people who merely saw the trigger warnings had a higher anxiety response than those who did not see the trigger warnings. Before I forget, this is what the trigger warning was in the study. Trigger warning. The passage you're about to read contains disturbing content and may trigger an anxiety response, especially in those who have a history of trauma. So, we can see right here that this is not an effective trigger warning. It contains no info on what the material is, and if I may just point something out, it's an awfully in-your-face sort of warning, right? It's phrased so that your mind probably goes to the worst thing it can think of. This is one of the things that I find oddly funny about the study in whole. The result here in specific is trigger warnings may increase anxiety, and yeah, if you're using a trigger warning like this, I think I believe you. It's a pretty anxiety-inducing trigger warning. You're literally suggesting right there that this could cause distress. Speaking of distress and anxiety, according to this graph from the study, the trigger warning in this case caused anxiety to increase by a whole 7-ish points. Would you say the following picture increases your anxiety from 47 to a 54? And how about this one? So remember, they found substantial evidence that the effect was about 7 points on average. This may be a good time to mention that the methodology for the study is almost exactly the same as the author's other studies on trigger warnings. This should make sense if you've paid attention, since the study was meant to be a replication of their other two studies. The results of that replication, the primary study did not replicate any of the significant results. Okay, let me be a little more clear here. Some of the results from the other two studies were that they found no effect, which you could say have been replicated in part of this study, on a group that wasn't solely people with PTSD. But any significant results regarding a measure effect? No replication. This is important because the significant result we were talking about with the increased anxiety on people who met a cutoff for PTSD symptoms, found using the same methodology that has been proven to have reproduction issues. So, don't blame me for holding my breath on whether this effect can be reproduced. Okay, so going back to our criteria from the beginning, do these results meet it? Sort of. It does look at people with PTSD symptoms, sometimes, but it doesn't necessarily match the triggers to trauma in this area, nor does it have a specific or useful trigger warning, which means that it doesn't really fit into our criteria, right? This isn't to completely dismiss the results. Even if not replicable, even if it fails to meet very basic experimental criteria, it does suggest there's a possibility that our second criteria for trigger warning effectiveness, reducing the effect of being triggered, isn't actually met. However, you also can't dismiss it based on this evidence. It just doesn't have enough backing to come down one side or the other. Clearly, there needs to be a study that specifically narrowly looks into trigger warnings and people with PTSD who are reading trauma-matching passages, because that's what all these studies are missing. They're looking at everyone and everything but the people who trigger warnings could help and the specific ways that they could help. Okay, so when I read scientific papers, I do try to come from a place of skepticism, but not dismissal. It's important to question and look through results, but it's also important to not come in with bias that you think the results will be right or wrong. At the start of this video, I tried to relay that I was coming in honestly, that I didn't come in with the goal to just dismiss the research. Because, let's be honest, when you're looking for ways to dismiss research, it becomes very easy. You can just say something like, well, this study is limited to college students in Missouri, which Okay, fair, but it's also possible this effect could be reproduced on a wider scale, and those specific limitations don't actually matter. Another tricky part of science is knowing what limitations make or break the research. What factors do you need to account for, and which ones don't actually matter? When I first started reading these papers, I really did come in from a position of trigger warnings could be bad, I want to know the truth. But then the more I read, the more I became soured to this entire line of research. The first thing that really started to turn me off was seeing how many of the studies don't look at people with PTSD, which none of them do. Even the ones published after this paper, I've not been able to find a single study that actually limits itself to people with PTSD. It is very frustrating to see these papers that don't screen for PTSD saying that their results indicate there's no benefit to trigger warnings. It feels disingenuous, like these papers either aren't concerned for how trigger warnings are used, or maybe only interested in finding evidence against trigger warnings. I'm going to be focusing on the primary paper for some particularly egregious examples of framing and phrasing that spurred me to make this video. But these methods of framing are not unique to this study. They are used in many, if not all, of the other research papers. They are used when people talk about the research, and they are most commonly used by people who will use any evidence they can find, regardless of truth. So, I hope by covering these methods, it'll help you see how evidence, regardless of its inherent strength, can be manipulated to fit an agenda. So, remember our first criteria for effectiveness? Avoidance? The primary study claimed it was tracking that, right? Let's see what it has to say. Quote, "This suggests that individuals did not use trigger warnings to avoid potential trauma cues. The number of overall dropouts, regardless of condition, was very small." This is, to be honest, the most insulting part of this study. They have the audacity to suggest that in their study where participants are getting paid, where dropping out means they don't get paid, their study where the participants who may not even have their PTSD being triggered are being paid to take the test to completion, that because only one person dropped out, people must not use trigger warnings to avoid triggering material. Just the sheer audacity of this, the sheer audacity to include this in the results. It's insulting. This result is meaningless. As researchers, they should know this result is meaningless, and them including any sort of statement on the meaning of this result, it is the thing that made me consider that maybe the researchers aren't actually interested in the truth. Maybe they just want to publish results that confirm their beliefs. Want to know the second most insulting part of the study? Let's talk about the centrality of event scale. Research has consistently borne out that the CES is positively correlated with PTSD symptom severity, meaning that a higher score on the CES tends to match a higher score on PTSD severity. This is an incredibly interesting find when it comes to treatment, because some studies have also found that when PTSD symptoms decrease with treatment, the CES score also decreases. It's incredibly important to note here, though, that correlation is not causation. To claim one causes the other, you either need a theory to justify it, or, more importantly, actual evidence of a causative effect. The primary study assumes that the CES causes PTSD symptom severity. Why do they assume this? They cite a study that claims CES can prospectively predict PTSD symptom severity. So let's take a look at that study. It was looking for causal evidence by recording CES and PCL5 scores for one event, and then 1 to 2 months later for a second event that occurred between then. The word prospective here means using the event before to predict the second event. And this is actually a somewhat interesting study. It at least creates interesting questions, because it says that it does find supporting evidence towards a causal relationship. Well, it sort of finds evidence. Not really, though. The study, quote, shows that the narrative specific to an event plays a crucial role in the relationship between event centrality and PTSD symptoms, and suggests event centrality is predictive of subsequent changes in PTSD symptoms, but not vice versa. So CES can be used to predict PTSD symptom severity of the second event, but not the other way around. However, the study comes with a few crucial caveats. The first is that it explicitly says there are other possible reasons for their findings beyond a causal relationship, and they suggest that it should be researched further. This is, by the way, what researchers are supposed to do. They're supposed to be aware of the limitations and keep the discussion of their results in line with that, though I think the CES study still falls a little short of that ideal. The second is that the study took place over 1 to 2 months, which is a fairly short time frame. By the way, in order for PTSD to be diagnosed, the symptoms need to persist for longer than 1 month. This is because many trauma survivors have PTSD-like symptoms for a short time after their traumatic event. PTSD is when those symptoms don't go away. 1 to 2 months is still quite a bit of time, but the study itself says that more research should be done over a longer amount of time. The likelihood that someone experienced a second traumatic event in the month between the two sampling is low, as the study admits, and it throws the validity of most of the results into question for broader applicability. Third, this study wasn't about people with PTSD either. From the study itself, again, quote, "The present study relied on an undergraduate sample, so it is essential that this work be replicated in samples with more serious trauma." God damn it. They point out the study is more of a start to broader research, trying to fill a gap that they noticed, but they make it clear what the limitations are in the study and urge for further research to be done. I still think they overemphasize their results relative to what they actually found, but at least they identify crucial limitations. So, putting this together, the primary study assumes a causal relationship based on a study that says, please do more research, and doesn't even screen for PTSD. Cool. Very cool. Why is the primary study so invested in a causal relationship between CES and PTSD? Well, they want to make the claim that being exposed to trigger warnings will increase someone's score on the CES and thus increase their PTSD symptom severity. Quoting from the primary study, "In other words, trigger warnings may harm survivors by increasing trauma centrality. They want a causal relationship so they can connect exposure to trigger warnings with worse PTSD symptoms overall." Now, the assumption of a causal relationship probably isn't entirely the fault of the authors. Most research on the CES assumes a causal relationship, as explored in this dissertation. I would recommend reading the first 6 pages of Chapter 4. It is both a good overview and a strong critique of CES research, though it is like 6 years old at this point. Regardless, other studies assuming a causal relationship does not excuse the authors for failing to provide substantial justification. You may be wondering, what evidence does the primary study have to support the idea that simply viewing trigger warnings will make trauma more central to someone's identity and, by their assumption, make PTSD worse? The group who received trigger warnings scored higher, on average, on the CES than the control group who did not receive trigger warnings. This result was substantial in that their Bayes factor was higher than 3. They do not comment on the strength of the effect, though there is a Cohen's d of 0.25. So this is, in my opinion, the only interesting and potentially useful result in the entire study. And for my analysis of the raw data, because they didn't do this, this increase seems to hold for people with PTSD symptoms. However, while the existence of the difference is supported by the evidence, the correlation itself is extremely weak. Here's the data, so you can see for yourself. There's a trend there. The one on the right is statistically higher than the one on the left, but as you can probably tell by looking at it, the correlation is weak. I mean, look at that spread. It's all over the scale. And you can see the small effect in their Ds. The confidence interval is so large that it'll cover multiple levels of effect size, which to me indicates that an exact relationship may be tenuously linked. So, what to make of this? Well, first off, since the theory that CES and PTSD symptoms being causally linked is based on inconclusive evidence, their conclusions simply do not follow from their results. Also, given the reproducibility problems with this methodology, the strength of the effect and the weakness of the correlation, I personally remain unconvinced by this evidence. Honestly, I find their claim that trigger warnings could increase PTSD severity to be irresponsible at best and downright disingenuous at worst. So, those were the two most insulting pieces of the paper, but there's a particular idea that is honestly downright scummy, and it's a common refrain amongst the papers opposed to trigger warnings. The more I read about this idea, the worse it became, and it has to do with exposure therapy. For those unaware, exposure therapy is a method for treating PTSD and phobias, and research suggests that it has been very effective. Honestly, if you want the best rundown on how exposure therapy works, I recommend reading this short article titled Exposure Therapy for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. It's about 15 pages, but it's a fairly easy read. It gives an extremely good review of the theory behind it, the evidence for it, and how it works in a clinical setting. Broadly speaking, though, exposure therapy seeks to eliminate triggers through exposure to those triggers. The trigger warning research papers, including the primary paper, will reference exposure therapy as a reason why trigger warnings and avoiding triggering materials is bad, actually. They will say avoidance is directly contradictory to the idea behind exposure therapy and, in fact, may be counter-therapeutic. But here's the thing. Exposure therapy is just that, a therapy. It needs to be practiced with a therapist who can ensure that the therapy is being done correctly and at the right pace. Because, guess what? Exposure therapy done incorrectly will make things worse. As quoted from the article on exposure therapy, only therapists trained in exposure therapy should attempt it with patients, as bad exposure therapy is simply bad therapy. The fact that these researchers are using a therapy that needs to be done by a trained therapist to suggest that trigger warnings will cause harm, if these people actually cared about exposure therapy, if they actually cared about people with PTSD, they would not be bringing it up in this context. Using exposure therapy as a justification to get rid of trigger warnings is dishonest. It's bad science, and it's harmful to patients who actually need help and could benefit from exposure therapy. If you're looking for a real discussion on trigger warning use, I recommend Evidence-Based Answers to Questions About Trigger Warnings for Clinically Based Distress, a review for teachers. That title is so long. It's just over 10 pages and is written to be balanced and, at times, frustratingly fair. It even ends with a call for more research, a little touch that I enjoy. So, at the end of all of this, what do we have? Well, first off, all of the trigger warning papers are bad research. They're just bad. They make bad data. They refuse to study people who have PTSD. They refuse to use accurate trigger warnings, and they refuse to use actually triggering material. It's just bad science. Second, in my opinion, all of these studies exist simply to build a body of evidence that trigger warnings don't work. Why? Because nobody's going to check if the research is bad. People don't read studies. They don't analyze the methodology. They regurgitate the results uncritically to support their position. Or worse, they take the results, strip them of all context and limitations, and use that false version as a bludgeon to push their narrative. The media landscape simply does not know how to talk about scientific research. Even among scientifically literate writers, they fail drastically. The New Yorker article I mentioned way at the beginning of this video, the one that pointed me towards these papers. It's written by a Harvard professor who, from her other columns, appears to be pretty sympathetic to students who have PTSD, and yet she misreported the results of these studies. The studies simply do not back a conclusion against trigger warnings. They don't back a conclusion for trigger warnings either. They simply have no conclusions worth considering because they're bad studies. And they will admit they're bad studies. They will tell you exactly what makes them bad, and then they will ignore that to make their studies seem significant. Quoting from the primary study here, trigger warnings should serve as an important caution to both clinical and non-clinical professionals who use interventions aimed to improve well-being among trauma survivors. Such practices should be thoroughly vetted via appropriate scientific techniques before they are adopted. Using unvetted interventions is irresponsible to victims of trauma. So says the paper that advocates for self-administered exposure therapy outside of therapeutic constraints. What's the problem with trigger warning research? There isn't any, and nobody cares to look for it.
So, I don't have a Patreon, but I want to feel like I'm important. So I'm going to include a list of names just scrolling along over there, names that I like, and do a little postscript. So I originally wrote this or recorded this script back in May of 2021, and I'm recording this in November of 2023. So, I'm very good at this video editing thing. But a year and a half means that a lot can change. Uh, and a lot actually just stays the same. I still have yet to find a research paper on trigger warning that focuses on people with PTSD as the subject, and despite several other papers coming out in the past year and a half, they all still have very similar methodology flaws. One particular thing I noticed that was interesting is the framing around the avoidance research. They will say things like only 13% of participants chose not to engage, as though that's too low a number to consider the effect of very bizarre behavior. Also, there was this one research paper that the distressing film that they chose to watch was Harry Potter. I cannot find it again, but honestly, iconic. Finally, please do check the footnotes. Most of it is just sources, but there are a few important annotations and various notes that I've included in there that are pretty important to the video overall. I really should have included them in the video itself, but if I try to go back and fix that now, it would take me another year to get this video out. So, we'll all just have to live with my mistakes. Okay, bye.
Yeah, that's good enough.